My name is Matt Robinson. Having done many different things to earn a living over the years, I'm currently training to be a specialist in public health through the HSC, mainly because I have an interest in or I'm concerned about climate change, air pollution, environmental impacts on the health of the population. So I would like in some way to do something about it. So I thought today I'd take an Irish perspective on things, and we've heard a lot already about the potential impacts of climate change on countries, well, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia. You know, they're going to be hit hard. But what's going to happen to us here? You know, we all have this image that we're going to be very safe, we'll pull up the drawbridge and we'll live very happily ever after. So I kind of trawled through a lot of reports, a lot of papers to try and find things to tell you this morning. Looking at the Irish perspective. So what do we predict is going to happen over the next few decades in Ireland? Well, the highest daytime temperatures will rise. It's going to get warmer here, there's no doubting that. We're going to get longer, drier summers, and during those summers there'll be increased episodes of water stress, you know, hosepipe bans, or even decreasing the water pressure in the system and other things. Now, overall, on an annual basis, it's predicted that we're going to get less rainfall in this country, but the rain that we do get is going to fall in shorter and sharper bursts. So it's going to increase the risk of flooding, increase the risk of crop destruction. So it's going to take a lot of adaptation to kind of be prepared for that. There we go, there's going to be an increase in very wet days by the mid-century. So how are these changes going to affect the population's health? Well, heat is the obvious one. With the average temperatures increasing, there's an association with, that's a 1 degree increase over 15 degrees is associated with an increase in total mortality. You know, so it kind of makes sense. If the day is hotter, it's going to be put more stress on the cardiovascular system, and those who are more vulnerable will suffer. In the long term, if we see an increase of 3 degrees in mean temperatures, then a back of the envelope calculation predicts that we'll see about 58 additional deaths per summer in Ireland. These increased hot days will inevitably lead to more people stripping off and spending time out in the sun. And we already have high rates of skin cancer in this country, and they're only set to rise if that happens. Now, there is some association between higher suicide rates and higher temperature, low rainfall, and more sunshine. That surprised me. I thought, you know, if you had rain every day for months on end, that would force people to become more miserable, but there is an association between that and higher temperatures. And due to these longer, hotter summers, the life cycle of plants will change. We'll have longer periods of pollination, which will affect people who have allergies and respiratory conditions. And also the increased temperatures will facilitate the increase in production of ground level ozone as well. Now, infectious diseases is a big one. We've heard several times already yesterday and this morning that increased temperatures will help bugs live and grow, and also the vectors that carry them. And it's predicted that in Ireland we'll see an increase in these diseases, which some of them have not been seen in Ireland yet. Some of them affect humans, others affect animals and cattle. So these are the things we need to be on the lookout for, you know, through increased surveillance. Increased flooding, increased rainfall as well will increase the contamination of private wells. We know that around 10% of the population gets their water from a hole dug in the ground, basically. The standards vary considerably. And we spend a lot of time in public health tracking and chasing infections due to water contamination in these wells. Now, I put this slide here because personally I feel in Ireland, we're a developed country, we have relatively good infrastructure and coping mechanisms. I don't feel that in the next few decades anyway, that the impacts of climate change or freak weather events will cause mass devastation to human health. You know, we're not like, for example, Bangladesh. Maybe we're flooding will kill lots of people. You know, we'll have flooding, it'll be disruptive, but I don't think it'll have a huge impact on human health, or direct impact on human health in the short term. It's going to be more of an insidious process, like the wearing away of this rock by wind and sand. You know, it's just things are going to chip away at us and at society, and we probably won't notice it until we reach these tipping points. Now, I think economic impacts are probably going to be one of the ways in which climate change affects us here in Ireland. You know, we live in a global economy. We sell stuff, we sell a lot of milk and beef abroad, and we import a lot of other fruit and vegetables and other foods. You know, we are not immune to the detrimental effects of climate change on other countries. You know, produce growers around the Mediterranean, you know, they're going to be hit hard by climate change, which will affect us here. There's no doubt about that. In Ireland, higher temperatures will lead to a decline in dairy production, reduced animal weight gain, stress on reproduction, the increased cost of production, and lower food conversion efficiency. So, you know, our current policy is to have more cattle in the country. You know, we want to produce more milk, more beef, but it's going to be harder if the temperature is rising and we're going to get freak weather events. It's predicted that by mid-century, the annual cost to agriculture is going to be 1 to 2 billion. The annual cost of climate change is going to be 1 to 2 billion euro. Storms of flooding, you know, the people who don't work in agriculture, we're also going to be affected. We saw twice this year the snow events, you know, everything ground to a halt. I couldn't go to work, you know, I had power cuts at home, I couldn't even log in to work. You know, we're pretty much paralyzed. You know, the effects on infrastructure, water shortages, power outages, you know, these have been and will be more affected by extreme weather events. This could lead to the possible disruption of market links and supply chains. And, you know, they're saying any society is only 3 meals away from anarchy. I looked up the origin of that this morning, and it varies between 2 meals and 6 meals, and nobody knows who said it first. But, you know, the looting we saw in City West, the people smashing Lidl with diggers, you know, you just need things to change to tip people over the edge, and you know, people can become desperate. By mid-century, there's an estimated 3 to 84%. That's a huge range, but there's an increase in food prices globally. You know, we're going to struggle to produce enough grain to feed our growing population. The prices will inevitably rise, and the poorer countries will get it, but also the poorer sections of society in every country. You know, if people can't afford to buy good quality fruit and veg, then they will not eat nutritious food, and that will have a detrimental effect on their health. So what's driving this? Well, we all know greenhouse gas production. In less than 2 years' time in Ireland, transport and agriculture sectors will produce over half of the CO2 emissions in this country. We're legally bound to reduce the emissions by 2020 to 80% of our 2005 levels. We're not going to get anywhere near to this. I think we'll be lucky to reduce them by maybe 1%. And because of that, we're going to start getting fined up to 600 million euro every year because we don't meet these targets. 600 million just sent to the EU, where it could have been spent here putting in place changes to mitigate and adapt to, you know, things we've been forewarned about. We know this is coming. We need to put plans in place. What can we do? Well, in terms of mitigation and adaptation measures, we tend to think of them in 3 parts. You know, the grey technological changes, which some people like to think are going to be the magic bullet that are going to solve all of our problems. You know, we can live as we are now because somebody will invent something that will suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. That's risky to put all your eggs in that basket, I think. We can change our use of the ecosystem. But I think these soft measures theoretically should be simple, but we've heard time and time again, yesterday and today, it relies on people making brave decisions and for people to change their behavior. And it's the people who are in power who can make the changes that will have the biggest impact. But it's difficult for them. Everybody has the currency in which they work, votes, money, health. We need to make it easier for politicians, I guess, to make these difficult decisions. They need to have evidence to back them up. Now, from my perspective, I'd like to put a health spin on things. I'd like to point out that it's not all doom and gloom. We're not just throwing money at making change just because we have these targets to meet. There are co-benefits to making these changes, co-benefits to health as well. We have to make changes to the transport and the agricultural sectors. They are the big emitters along with the energy sector. So, they are going to feel the pinch sooner or later. So it would be nice to put a bit of thought into it and have systems in place to make some, have a smooth landing rather than abrupt fall into the abyss. So what changes can we make to the transport sector? Well, increased investment in electric vehicles and in infrastructure to promote the walkability of urban areas, the cyclability. These are things that have been proven to work in other cities around the world. Vancouver, the cities in Denmark, in the Netherlands. London is becoming a very cycling-friendly city because they've got a very proactive mayor there. And they see reductions in carbon emissions, but also other co-benefits, which I'll mention in a second. I think we also need to take a step back and think, why are people using their private motor vehicles as much as they do? It's crazy here in Ireland. Everybody drives everywhere from what I've seen. We need to think, how can we structure society and our cities and towns so that we don't need to drive to the supermarkets? People don't need to leave their homes, in the commuter belt and sit in traffic for an hour to get into Dublin. Can we not think outside the box and develop, local working hubs where people can work remotely? We have so much technology available to us, especially here in Ireland. I think we need to have a bit of innovative thinking and break from our normal work and travel culture. Now, the EPA states that we have 1,200 premature deaths in Ireland every year due to air pollution, and that's on the increase. By implementing changes such as these, we can definitely reduce our air pollution, which will have a knock-on effect to people's respiratory and cardiovascular health. Also, we know physical inactivity, obesity are big risk factors for premature death, cardiovascular disease and premature death. And there are, endless numbers of papers out there that show that by simply taking public transport, or especially walking or cycling to work, you can get your recommended daily amount of physical activity, which will reduce your risk of premature death. So it all ties in. There are co-benefits to making these very difficult and expensive changes. The problem is that the payoff is further down the line. Agriculture. We have 7 million plus cattle in the country at the moment, and the plan is to increase that even more. It's a big emitter of greenhouse gases. We've seen this year, with the fodder crisis, with farmers really struggling to cope financially and mentally with the demands and the strains put on them. We need to support them to diversify. We can't put all our eggs in the milk and beef basket, because that's risky. We're vulnerable to insults. We need to spread our bet, I think. And we also need to be more resilient to short, sharp, rainfall or temperature spikes or storms. Now we know that suicide is a known issue in Ireland, and we know that agricultural workers are particularly vulnerable, especially, I was reading a paper this morning, male farmers between the ages of, say, 45 and 55. they're struggling to keep their businesses going. I grew up in a rural community, a farming community on the west coast of Wales, and I speak to my friends there, and they say farming is just a hobby now. You know, they rely on subsidies from the government. They can't run a proper business. You know, they need to be able to diversify, but it's risky and expensive for them, so they need to be supported. We need to maximize self-sufficiency in all foods in this country. You know, we're a net importer of calories, and we import fruit and vegetables. You know, that makes us vulnerable to price fluxes in countries outside of Ireland. So it would be nice to think that we could just kind of have the capacity to cope with any fluxes in those prices. And again, you know, reducing the cattle numbers. We have by far and away the highest rates of VTEC, virotoxigenic E. coli infection in this country. It's a bug carried in the stomachs of ruminants, and it passes onto the ground and into our water systems, or directly from the animal to people. And you know, if we just add more and more cows and cow poo to the country, I think it's inevitable that we're going to get more infections like this. So if we can reduce the exposure, reduce the numbers, then we're going to have a reduced risk of these diseases happening. I could go on forever, but that's my time up.
GOAL as an agency has worked a long time in Malawi, and between humanitarian response and development, so we've been doing a lot of disaster risk reduction in Malawi over the last few years, and this came around. This program is trying to put climate change adaptation and population dynamics together. We did get a grant from USAID for it. Unfortunately, they pulled the grant because the two words are in the title, climate change and family planning. So they pulled the grant this year. So I'm just going to present really how far we got. And it was to run to 2020, so we were hoping for much more exciting results, but that's where we are. So PaMawa stands for Youth as Agents of Change. Okay. So I think there's been a couple of presentations on Malawi during the conference. So very similar. It's a population climate change hotspot according to the sort of Population Action International. But after what Niall said this morning, maybe we're all a hotspot now. So yeah, I mean the population growth. You can see the growth rate is 3.24%, so predicted to be 38 million by 2040. Fertility rate is still very high, 4.4. Its main agriculture is rain-fed, mainstay of the economy. 80% of farmers are subsistence farmers. So, and the erratic rains and the droughts that has been mentioned even by Matt here this morning is just continuing in Malawi, and we now would have a drought every year and a flood that we would be responding to as GOAL, particularly in the south of the country here. And those three yellow ones are where we did this particular program, because those are some of the most vulnerable populations in Malawi for this. Yeah. So that's the Malawi context and why we decided to do this. We did get a very nice grant in that we had a whole year to understand the context and develop our program. And this program, so we did a lot of interviewing of the population, and what we were looking at was exploring the linkages between climate change and the population dynamics, and what was the community or the people's understanding of it. It was very mixed. I mean, there was conflicting views among the community. The larger families were saying we need the larger families because we need the labour, and smaller families were saying, no, we're better when a drought happens because we have more food and we can last longer. There was all that, and there was a consensus that they did get why there was a drought, why there was a flood. So they had a great understanding, even among those who weren't educated, of what was happening, and there was complete change. And I think when you talk to farmers now than we would have talked to them 5 years ago, there's an even increasing. And some of that is because there's a lot of focus in Malawi on climate change adaptation. Yeah? Very little on climate change adaptation and population dynamics, but it is increasing. Yeah? The one thing that we did see is that the youth have very little access to sexual and reproductive health services, and for anybody who works in health development, that isn't a surprise. It's one of the last things to kick in on a health, because we tend to focus on the very basics, primary health care. So only 28% of youth had actually been to a family planning centre, and only 27% of health facilities that we surveyed were certified as youth friendly, and less than 6% of the youth had ever heard a message or a talk on climate change. That was for the elders, it wasn't for the youth. We also measured in this here, a goal has a resilience toolkit that was developed in South America, and we measured the resilience of the community here at the start of the program with the intention to measure it at the end. Using that, it looks at 5 components. I'll have to read the paper, hold on. Great. I normally present with my notes in front of me, and you can talk to people, but it's not happening here. So it's a community resilience measurement, but it's 6 areas: governance, and then the assessment, the shocks, the stresses, education, disaster risk reduction, and disaster preparedness. And inside the governance, you have all the health, all those WASH, social, the basics, the agriculture, all of those things. Quite a good tool for measuring resilience. So that was also part of our baseline. We also did behaviour barriers. Goal has an approach to social behaviour change. It's one of our 4 fundamental pillars of all our programming, so it has to be in all our programs. It's Cascade. It's called Challenging the Attitudinal, Structural, Cultural Attitudes. Yeah? And we also did with youth and elders a very large barrier analysis, looking at what were their barriers to making choices about changing agricultural practices and accessing family planning. So those were the 2 big conversations. They're the usual. I don't think anybody's surprised by what's on the board. Culturally, it's male dominance, the man makes the decision, how many more children you're going to have, can you access family planning? And then, I did mention this earlier, older people would have said we need large families because a percentage of them are going to die, and we need to have people to support us in our old age. And of course the religion is discouraging the use of family planning. And I mentioned the inaccessibility of sexual and reproductive health. So we designed this model. We had climate change adaptation, and we also had sexual and reproductive health information running at the same time, with the youth as the agents of the change across 300 communities. So it was quite a big target group. We targeted 10 to 35-year-olds because that is the standard government age for youth in Malawi, in case anybody's wondering. Okay? It's fairly standard in East Africa, actually. So, yeah. So therefore, you have to look at schools, and you also have to look at youth who are out of school. Okay? And we had 3 steps to this. Again, I think just because we were lucky, we had the time. You don't often get as much time as we had here. We had a whole year to develop this program. So we were able to take the evidence we had and develop integrated messages, and look at, so first of all, we looked at what messages were available, and then developed the more appropriate ones, etc. We were also able to develop a learning by action program, and then refer and link people to the different climate change activities that were going on in the youth. Yeah? And I think you see the numbers there, so it's quite high. Right, so these were some of our messages. As I said, there was quite a lot of messages out there, but a lot of them singing from different hymn sheets, just different message about pregnancy, family planning. Climate change adaptation was not really there. It was more you have to increase your production by using A, B, C, whatever. So we tried to to develop messages that spoke to them and the information they gave us, yeah? And so that was one of their statements. We'll have as many children as we want if we can support them. Yeah? So that was to get then people, the youth, to start thinking, well, what does it mean to support a child? What does that actually mean? Yeah? That's one. So we used several different, once we selected our messages, and we had 3 or 4 main messages, we then used several different types of communication channels to do this. And in social behaviour change, you tend to have NGOs will do a lot of community behaviour change and community discussion, but it doesn't tie into any mass media messaging, and there's a lot of constricting messages or conflicting messages for people. So as you can see from there, we had quite a lot. We had, so we'll start at the top, radio message, jingles and programs was 3 radio programs went out over different stations, 104 sessions in total in the time period of the project. It would have continued if we had been continuing, but and then around that we had in each youth club radio listening clubs where they discussed the messages and what those messages meant for them and their families. And from that, then they also had to take action with their families. So trying to disseminate the messages all the way down. We had open ground meetings with leaders, religious leaders, on climate change adaptation, family planning, population dynamics. We also had the phone messaging, so they could phone in or SMS in a question to a platform on climate change adaptation and SRH. The community-led action was actually followed on from the radio listening clubs, where the youth actually got the whole community together to discuss the messages. And it's done as participatory learning and action. You go through it using sort of like role plays and dramas, and you've all seen those. And then what's the action we need to take as a community in each community. The interpersonal and school messaging debates, this was led by the youth, and they tended to set up their own communication channels and who they needed to talk to. And there is a social media channel for the program as well, which is actually going to be continued. And there was debates and quizzes in the schools. Did I forget anything? Nope. I suppose when you're embedded in a program, you remember it all, don't you? So this is something learning by action. This is probably, according to our resilience advisor, the weakest part of our program. It was probably developed before she came on board. So it's demonstration gardens, and they called it climate smart agriculture, but it's literally teaching the youth how to use the seeds properly and seed banks, and those basic things that we think that everybody knows. And you'd have to. A lot of people are questioning: is that actually climate change adaptation, or is that just smarter agriculture? So, it's just words, really. The village saving and loans was something that we had some resistance initially at the beginning, because it's like giving the youth this, ability to change things, because they have money in their finances; they're not controlled by the elders. But that has actually worked very well for the youth. And they really see the benefits of that, and saving for their child's education and learning the financial management and all of those things that are involved in being a parent. Energy saving stoves. Energy saving stoves was part of trying to reduce, obviously, the use of charcoal, etc., etc. But of course, the evidence is growing on the value of a fuel-efficient stove from an air pollution point of view, which I'm sure I was going to talk about. So, you have to put some of this in brackets from a climate change perspective. And then just trying to get them to change away from subsistence farmers to having farming to other types of sort of livelihood outputs like beekeeping and forestry and stuff that they can, use. Okay, and then we also had youth-friendly health services, where we mentored health workers and established health-friendly services in each health facility, and then also worked with families on allowing the youth to access that and how that's accessed. We also we linked the youth and trained them a little bit in advocacy with agricultural departments, the forestry departments, the SRH. We got them just to meet the people and the leaders and to challenge the leadership. Yeah, we had interface meetings where they came along to the schools and also for out-of-school youth. We also hooked them up with other NGOs who were doing livelihoods and different types of livelihoods, and who were also doing health and different types of health. And I suppose what we saw ourselves was more a facilitator of the process than actually being in as goal. We were just facilitating, yeah. Usually it's the other way around, the NGOs doing a lot of the work, whereas this was very much led by the youth. And then we, the government actually within a year of us starting established a national level advocacy on climate change and population dynamic. So that board now sits, a working group actually, and it's to target influential leaders in the country to try and do both. As I said, we were curtailed, but we did do an end line there in September. Some of it now is quantitative. The villages we went to and the youth would have said yes, they would definitely now choose, the majority would choose now to have smaller children because they can see the cost, what it costs, and how important it is that their children have a life after. So it was sort of showing all of that. The amount of SRH services increased completely, and I haven't the figure written down, but, oh, I have. So 7,324 youth in 6 months of the program, the message is going out, actually accessed reproductive health. Yeah? We increased community resilience in a very short period of time by 6%. This is measured through Goals ARC tool. Please don't ask me any more questions. It's done by our resilience advisor, but anybody wants information on it, more than happy to put you in touch with Isabel. And there's actually a presentation, where is it? Is it Lisa? In New Orleans, I think, next week on the ARC toolkit.
I wasn't quite sure what was most useful to cover in this presentation, but I think it's very important to look at the extent of the problem of household air pollution, because even public health professionals are shocked at the significance of the issue. I'm going to talk then a little bit about some of our current work, scaling up cleaner fuels in Africa. And then, as everyone likes to, I'm going to talk about the kind of thing which is most interesting to me, which is about using mixed methods in the research that we're doing, and also promoting the use of the user voice alongside the experts, mostly the medics and the scientists, in that process of scale up. Okay, so there's around about 3 billion people who cook with solid fuels across the world. And around about 4 million people each year die as a result of that, 4 million. Solid fuels is mainly wood and charcoal, but it also includes other things like crop wastes and even plastic in some cases. And these are cooked on either a three-stone fire, traditional three-stone fire, or an inefficient traditional stove. So why is that such a serious problem? Well, the thing about the way that this fuel is burned is that it results in what we call incomplete combustion for those scientists that we've got here. And that means that it produces a number of different substances, which we refer to as particulate matter. In particular, particulate matter, which can be very, very small diameter, this particular one called PM2.5, can lodge very far down in your lungs and cause all sorts of respiratory problems, but also cardiovascular problems as well. And it also produces carbon monoxide, which people are more familiar with as a health hazard, sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides as well. And the thing about using these open fires within the household is that it actually results in a level of particulate matter that is more than 50 times the WHO recommended guidelines. And of course, as you can imagine, due to the nature of the domestic tasks of cooking, it tends to be women and children who are most exposed to this, because the children tend to be with their mothers all the time. This particular lady here is from Cameroon, and actually this picture here I think is from Guatemala. But the stoves themselves, you can imagine, you can even see here the amount of smoke that you've been exposed to, and anyone who's ever been into any of these kitchens, it's actually unbearable. I don't understand how somebody can stay in there. It really is very, very difficult to tolerate. So let's just put that health hazard into a bit of a perspective. We've done a lot of work around the global burden of disease studies, which some of you might be familiar with over the last few years, and it's given us a much better idea of the extent of the problem of household air pollution. As I say, there's 4.3 million people who die every year as a result of it. But that is actually 45 times the number of annual deaths that you would expect to see from a natural disaster. And it's also more than twice the number of the people who are dying from AIDS every year. So it's shocking. It's really shocking. It's actually, and I mentioned this in the session yesterday, it's the biggest environmental problem facing the world today in terms of health. That's how important it is. As I say, the cause of death is usually related to respiratory disease, chronic obstructive airways disease, or cardiovascular disease, particularly myocardial infarction and strokes, but it also causes cataracts, small for dates babies, and importantly, it's a very important risk factor for childhood pneumonia. In fact, we think that for children under 5 globally, it probably causes around half of the cases of childhood pneumonia. That's about 1 million deaths every year from cooking on these fires with small children. And then, of course, there are other issues that aren't so directly connected with health, which result from cooking with these fuels. It's typically women and children who actually gather the fuels, as you can imagine. So this has negative impacts in terms of the actual time that they've spent, the collection time. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 hours a day collecting wood, and that's time that could be spent in education or in paid labour. It also puts documented evidence that it puts women at risk of injury, but also rape as well during the time of collection. And although it's a horrible thing to have to talk about, there is also a huge risk from burns. So because young children are typically near their mothers, if you can imagine having a very small room with a toddler in there and an open fire in the middle of that room, there's a risk of horrific burns and scalds to children from knocking over pots or even from actually falling into the fire. So none of this is very cheerful stuff, is it? Well, this is the only technical slide I'm going to put up, but I'm going to put it up because I think it's really important. In 2014, the World Health Organization actually developed guidelines for household air pollution, and our group led on the development of those guidelines. And the purpose of these guidelines were to help policymakers think about what they should be doing in practice in order to reduce this problem. And this is a graph of something called an integrated exposure response curve. It's based on the global burden of disease studies, but in slightly simpler terms, on the y-axis here we've got relative risk of basically pneumonia among children under the age of 5, and on the x-axis we've got exposure to this really tiny particulate matter, PM2.5. And the important thing to pick up from this graph is that the relationship is not linear. So what that means is that the risk of pneumonia rises very steeply, even at these really very low levels of PM2.5. Now that has serious implications for global policy on household air pollution. Because if we think about an open fire, it may have somewhere between 250 and 600, that's the end of that x-axis, 600 micrograms per metre cubed of PM2.5. And even if we use an improved cook stove, even the best improved cook stoves that are on the market now, when we've tested them in the field, they've only brought down the level of PM 2.5 to about 200 here, which you can see still puts children at twice the risk of pneumonia compared to cleaner fuels. So what this actually means in practice is improved cook stoves will not do the job. We need to move away from this idea of scaling up improved cook stoves. It's wasting time and it's wasting resources. Now, this is from the guidelines that were published in 2014. The Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, as you can tell by its name, very powerful organisation, were a little bit reluctant to take this on board at the time. They've now changed their name to, can somebody remind me what they're now called? The Clean Cooking Alliance, they've changed their name to now, so they've kind of divorced themselves a little bit from improved cook stoves. But this message still needs to get out there. So in simple terms, what that means is we need to be looking at cleaner fuels. And by cleaner fuels, we're talking about gas and electricity. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the work that we're doing with cleaner fuels very briefly in Africa. And this is work that I'm doing with the Energy, Air Pollution and Health Group, which is led by Dan Pope at the University of Liverpool. And what we're doing is we're seeking to upscale liquid petroleum gas, or LPG. The main reason for that is that fuel switching to LPG can be achieved much more rapidly than thinking about switching to other options such as electrification, particularly in rural areas in Africa, or even piped gas. The second thing to say about LPG is it's very abundant. We've currently got an excess of production over use, over consumption, so it's there for us to use. It's a byproduct of crude oil production. And thirdly, although it is, you would be right to point out that it is a fossil fuel, the widespread use of LPG across Africa and parts of Asia and also Latin America means that people currently using biomass, obviously, it would lead to a huge reduction of emissions, so it would have a positive effect on climate change. It would also lead to forest preservation because obviously people would not need to go out and collect wood. And finally, very importantly, it would lead to a reduction in women and children's time in terms of labour. Children get taken out of school at the age of 9 or 10 so they can contribute to wood collecting, so it increases education, increases time for income to be earned outside of the home. So our project in Africa, we're actually working in Cameroon, Ghana and Kenya. It's a project that's funded by NIHR to the tune of around about £2 million. And there's actually 4 different strands to that project. We're looking at developing strategies to support equitable uptake of clean fuel. So that's working at really a very top level with the government. We're looking at estimating impacts of scaling up LPG, developing capacity of the health systems, and also improving engagement between public and policy makers. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work. As I mentioned, the scale-up field has mostly been dominated by medical doctors who are interested in reducing pneumonia, and also scientists who are interested in measuring household air pollution. And that work is extremely important. But one of the consequences is that much of the literature is very quantitative focused, and the user voice has tended to be missing from the debate. So much of my work has involved promoting and integrating mixed methods, so qualitative methods, and also giving a voice to users and increasing their involvement in the process. And this, to me, I mean, again, this isn't rocket science. It's absolute common sense. If scale-up's going to be successful, stakeholders must respond to the needs of users and find ways of enabling users to cook in the ways that they want to cook that meet all their cooking needs. I mean, it's just common sense, isn't it, really? So mixed methods can allow us to actually do that. And one of the things I'm trying to do, this is a model that I've been adapting. Rosenthal, we developed a model first, Rosenthal adapted it, I'm readapting it now. This is a model which I'm interested in looking at the position of lay knowledge and expert knowledge. And you can see, in terms of LPG upscale, these are the different domains we need to think about. So we need to have a really strong enabling environment at a national level. We need to think about industry structure. We need to think about energy pricing, and importantly, we need to think about user and community experience in the context of socioeconomic situation and also the demographic setting. And we need to make sure that this user and community experience feeds back to the industry structure and enables them to make sure that we have in place what we need to have in place. So some of the interventions that we're looking at in Africa at the moment include promotion of pressure cookers, because it saves on LPG use, quicker cooking, provision of microloans to the poorest communities to actually buy the initial LPG equipment, improving the distribution chain, because access to LPG can often be a problem in rural areas, and encouraging legislative change so that gas use is actually safe and the communities can use it knowing that it's safe. And then, most importantly, finally for me, it's about understanding the reasons for what we call stove stacking. So stove stacking means using your nice improved stove or your LPG stove, but you use it alongside your traditional stove, which of course, in terms of household air pollution, rather defeats the object. So we need to understand much more about why communities continue to use both stoves, and then address those issues to enable them to use and to want to use cleaner fuels more easily. But so it's not just about uptake, it's very much about exclusive use of cleaner fuels. And for me, promoting the user voice in all this debate and making sure it's heard will lead to a much firmer evidence base to allow us to do that.